Um, all right, so I guess we can just start with some introductions, and hopefully by the time we get through ours, we'll get Miranda in. But I guess I can start. My name is Rae D'Arc. I'm probably on this panel because I was labeled the innocent one among my band, choir, and orchestra friends. However, none of them ever saw my art. So I'm on this panel because I wrote Don't Date the Haunted, which is such a soft horror that I call it a dark romantic comedy instead. But yeah, that's my little pitch. So let's see. Let's go for. Oh, did we get her? Maybe LS, you can go next.
Sure. My name is LS Johnson. My pronouns are she, her. I write weird fiction and dark fantasy. I've written I published three out of a quartet of queer Gothic novellas that a reader described as Lovecraft meets Jane Austen. And I've published over 40 short stories and self-published 2 collections of those.
Oh, I guess. Miranda, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was your question?
I'm just going in the angle of my screens.
Okay, are we just doing introductions? Because I just came in a little late.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries.
Here you are, and why you might be on this panel.
Okay. My name is Miranda Renae. My debut novel came out this year. It's called Wonderland. It is a PG horror, so it's really light horror and a retelling of Alice in Wonderland. Probably why I'm here.
Stephen?
Hi, I'm Stephen Gashler. I write young adult fantasy humor. Such as this one, it looks like a horror novel, but it's honestly more of a joke. At the same time, though, I have been a part of scary storytelling for a while. I've won the Utah's Hauntings contest a few times, and I run it now. So I've had some exposure to the art of scary storytelling, as has my wife. Together, we create musical theater, and this last year we put on a production called Take My Death Away, which is kind of a turn-of-the-century rural American bluegrass ghost story, and that was a lot of fun.
Okay, so I guess for our first question, what are some books or authors you would suggest for, or that would be horror for the sensitive soul? You can just jump in.
Are we going to go through the grid, I imagine? Say more.
Whichever. If you have like a super strong opinion, then that's fine. But we can even go backwards if Stephen, you have something to go first.
Order. It's all yours, LS. Go for it.
Okay, I wasn't chomping at the bit, but okay. I was when I was thinking about that question, I was actually thinking about how we define sensitive soul in this case. I feel like a lot of people get upset by different things, and I have seen people giggle through slasher movies like it's the most hilarious thing in the world, while other people are cringing behind the seats. And so I think it's a hard question for me to answer because I'm not sure what other people's triggers are. I know my triggers, and I know exactly what I don't want to read. But I think the nice thing about horror is that it's not a genre. I don't think of it as a genre the way like fantasy or science fiction are genres. They don't have like specific story elements. It's more of like a psychological space. And so as a result, it's a huge umbrella. And you can have, it encompasses dark fantasy and ghost stories and occult and paranormal and slasher and all sorts of stuff under there. So when I'm thinking about, trying to get people into horror who might otherwise shy away from it, my first step is always just to steer them to anthologies, because that way they can get a real sense of the many flavors of horror. The year's bests, the Ellen Datlows. 2 years ago, I worked on a charity anthology for wildfire victims in California, and we tried to have every flavor of horror in there, from funny to gross and monsters and ghosts and everything in between. So I think that's always a good place to start if you want to dip your toes in, but you're not quite sure.
I guess I'll go next.
Okay.
Sorry, was the question what are some books we recommend, or was it?
Yeah, mostly
like,
what books would you recommend for
Okay.
the sensitive soul? But yeah, maybe define what sensitive soul means to you personally, because
Sure.
as LS mentioned, like that can
Yeah.
vary.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
So I am one of those people who laugh at slashers. I don't really watch them as a rule, but some of them. Let's see, what's one? But the lady in the woman in black. I thought that was the most funny movie because having a degree or having a background in film and being one who creates video production, to me it's just really funny to think about the behind the scenes of how the woman in black appears at all the creepy places at all the right times. And I'm just like, wow, this supernatural entity has this amazing sense of dramatic tension and showmanship and storytelling. And it's just so funny to me. So the things that actually creep me out are definitely more subtle and psychological, probably of the H.P. Lovecraft variety. For example, if somebody's coming at somebody with a chainsaw, that's kind of scary, but like they either die or they don't. It's just like I can move on. But when a sailor washes ashore on an island covered with strange, macabre fish-like creatures and then uncovers an ancient monolith, and this reptilian fish-like man emerges from it and seeps into his mind, and then he slowly but surely goes crazy as this daunting, luminous figure haunts him with no escape and respite whatsoever, and he's powerless to control it. That's kind of scary, because that puts you at the edge of your imagination and it makes you feel powerless. A more concrete example I could think of in film would be Martin Scorsese's Silence. And this is a film about Japanese persecution of Christian missionaries and converts in like the 1600s. And it's terrifying to me as a religious person because it deals with the questions of what if there is no God? What if all these people are dying for nothing? What if prayers are really unanswered and we're in this huge existential vacuum and there's no meaning to any of it? That's the kind of existential horror that gives me the chills.
Good point. Do you have anything to add?
For me, I usually ask people more what they watch on television. That gives me a better idea of what you're going to be more interested in. But I do love the anthology idea. That's a great way to get somebody introduced into a ton of different types of horror.
For me personally, I was introduced to horror through short stories, like the little, short and shiveries, or like the dark tales to read in the dark, or I'm blanking on those things. It's just all of those little shorts, or even just like the classic short, like The Lottery, or all of those just short stories that really give you a punch because of the horror element. And then of course like the paranormal romances, or just all the other versions of horror and like psychological versus like monsters. There's a wide range, and everything will kind of prick people in different ways depending on what they believe, what they how they react, or just so lots of good points in there. So then question, like, is there a line anywhere for sensitivity? Like, books don't have rating scales like movies do, or like and podcasts don't have rating scales of like, this is rated R, So what can you do as creators to make sure you're hitting the right audience?
My thought is probably the intent behind it. I'm not one who likes to draw sort of an arbitrary line of if there's this much blood, it's this rating and so forth. And I think it's more of what's the purpose of it? If it is to elicit shock value, that is something that I would personally avoid. But good horror, if it fulfills a function, does a lot for you. One, it teaches you empathy for others in extreme situations. In a safe environment, you can learn about courage and principle and how you would act in an extreme situation. You learn about the human spirit in the extremities and what we're capable of. With the more psychological, paranormal stuff, you are pushing the imagination and exploring the outer limits. So there's all these really good benefits of doing this that to me makes it a very worthwhile thing. And that's what I would say is my benchmark as to whether it's worthwhile and something I'd be comfortable or having my kids read, as opposed to, whether or not there's blood. At the same time, having done a lot of scary story contests, we do sort of draw the line at gratuity, like if you're just describing intestines coming out and blood squirting all over the place. Like, again, what is the function of that? Are you just grossing out the audience? If so, then you do want to avoid that. You want to keep it more just general audiences. Again, if that is your intent. I'm not saying that there's no market for gratuity, because there certainly is.
I'm the rare breed of horror writer that I'm very for content warnings. I was back and forth on them for a while, and then a couple of years ago, I read a book, and I was telling myself I'm like a professional writer. I should be able to read anything. I should just, power through this thing, and that thing messed me up so badly. It was so personally triggering. I was like a wreck for about 3 weeks. And it made me realize that as much as I may aim my books at audiences and try to market them in certain ways, and, I can never absolutely tell how it's going to land. And that one thing I could do is just to kind of flag a few things. I do it so I did it in my second collection. And if I redo my first collection, I'll put it in the back. And I put them in the back of the book. So if you don't want to look at them, you don't have to look at them. You don't need to know. But they're there if you want them, if you're worried that something might really set you off. For me as a reader, because now I filter, I'm not going through 3 weeks of hell again. I look at Goodreads reviews. I look at Amazon reviews. I am a fan of the Does the Dog Die website, just so I know, because the thrill and the jump scare isn't worth that potential psychological flatline. And I know, I talk to a lot of horror writers, and they're like, it's horror, you should just, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen kind of thing. And I think that does a real disservice, because as Stephen was saying, there's a huge amount of psychological good that can happen. Horror is a real bounded space where you can explore all sorts of uncomfortable things that you might not have a place to deal with otherwise. And it really does people a disservice to say, well, if you don't like gore, then you shouldn't touch the genre at all. I will also say that, like, if you see hardcore anywhere in the title or the blurb, that's probably not for a good starting place. Let's skip the hardcore.
For me, when I'm writing, I have specific readers that I have that I know will tell me, yeah, you went a little too far there, maybe pull that back. Reading, I do the same thing. Reviews, I am one to look at the last page of the book, actually, to see if it's something I want to continue to read.
Peter? I have beta readers going over book 2 right now of Don't Date the Haunted, and and I've been asking them in when giving them the book of like, hey, let me know if this is too gruesome or too romantic in some scenes. Like, let me know, because you read the first book and I want to cater it to the same audience, which is you guys. And so, yeah, that's great. And there are different ways to market. I think, LS, you mentioned, like, be sure you market to that audience. Other than book cover or blurb, are there other ways to really, like, specifically market to the right audience and make sure you're reaching the people who will love your book and not be or love your work for Stephen in general.
Well, I self-publish. I have control over my marketing. So it's like I can pick certain advertising keywords and block them or not, and kind of filter that way. I also do a lot of in-person book selling where and I've learned to really fine tune the pitch of my books depending on who I'm talking to. I get a lot of moms who come up who are looking for like reading material for their teenagers. And I can say, well, the novellas are okay. The short stories might be a little, we can talk about age and comfort levels and things like that. But again, it's hard because horror has people have such a knee-jerk reaction. They just basically think either slasher or Stephen King, and you have to kind of help them unpack that and say, well, no, there's a lot of other things under the umbrella, and you should really give it a try.
I think what really terrifies people is when bad things happen to good people for apparently no reason. And so when there's a lot of violence and it doesn't seem to be in some sort of overarching purpose, that's when it really kind of confuses people and invokes these feelings. What we do is most of our shows are family friendly that we put on. And so when we did do this Halloween show last year that has some scary content in it, we were very worried about that consistency, as you were talking about. And so we did do a content warning on it, and we listed very specifically all the things that happen. This guy says the word hell. This guy gets stabbed. These characters are dragged down to hell. There's talks of seance and paranormal activity and so forth. And we were worried that it would be off-putting to a lot of people. It wasn't. We never had anybody complain at all about any of the content. We had lots of families bring their kids, and they all loved it from what we've heard. And I think, again, that's because it was all within a larger framework of good conquers evil, and there is meaning and hope and beauty and so forth. I think of Brandon Sanderson, who's so popular among these circles, and he writes more death and destruction and pain and suffering than anything I've ever read. So many people die in his novels, right and left. And yet, I don't think that's off-putting to a lot of people who at the same time would not go see a slasher film or even an R-rated movie, because it's, again, for the purpose of showing heroism and that good triumphs over evil.
Anything to add, Miranda?
I'm still learning this. No, I'm still learning the marketing stuff, so I don't have a lot to say there.
Great, we're all learning together.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and we've talked a little bit about like the differences in different medias or mediums. So is there like, I don't know, like if your book or your thing was put in a different medium, would you put different like warnings on it? Like, is there a difference, you think, between the horror or book horror or movie horror or audio or podcast horror or other mediums?
Well, sorry.
Someone's popular. Okay, Miranda, did you want to start?
I don't know. I think that's one of those things that also depends on the person. Sometimes seeing things visually is a lot worse than hearing it or reading it. I know for me, I cannot handle any gore in movies whatsoever, but a little bit in a book, I'm okay. So I think that's also kind of a personal preference.
Yeah, I would agree. And I just, I was thinking of that in terms again of kind of people being able to judge what they want to take on. I think for me, there's a huge difference between seeing something in a dark theater and reading it in a book where even if it's really starting to push my buttons, I could take it out in the sunshine around nice people and like, oh, look at the daisies. And then I'll read another couple pages and look at, and kind of, you can I can control better how it's affecting me, and I can also control my own imagination better than when I'm just being presented. And it wasn't as big a deal to me when I was a kid, and I think part of that was just being a kid, and part of that was also just the quality of like 80s horror movies wasn't quite up to me, wasn't there, but like effects have gotten better. And I think I find it a much more intense experience now to try to sit through a real, violent horror movie than it used to be.
Yes, I think there is power in confronting those things, as kind of we talked about, this idea of learning courage in a safe environment. I used to be absolutely terrified by the movie Watcher in the Woods, Disney's little horror film of the 80s. And when I would tell that to people, they would always laugh at me. And in hindsight, it's really not that scary. But to a kid, it's terrifying. And to be able to look in a mirror now and not be afraid that the scary mummy woman is going to get me is empowering.
One of my favorite movies is The Mummy, but I know if I had watched it when it first came out, I would have been like, no. Well, for me personally, like books, you can skip over scenes that you don't like. Like you can just like, okay, they're starting to get frisky with each other. I'm just gonna skip that and go to the next paragraph. With audio, sometimes the narrator really gets into it, and I listened to 1984 on audio. I should have read it. Because the torture scenes, he was so into the torture scenes, and just like, okay, this is a little much for me. I'm like, I would have preferred to have read it versus, and like you think of War of the Worlds, that was originally done, or that was done over radio, and it sent people into panic because they thought it was real, like a real podcast. And so it's just kind of interesting to see how different mediums have different powers over people. And then, video has its own things. And that is an interesting thing where if you see the book leaves a lot, or just reading it leaves a lot to the imagination unless there are pictures. And then movies, they play a lot on maybe not showing the monster, right, until later, because the monster, I think it was mentioned earlier on another panel, that the monster's scarier until you see it. So, as authors and creators, how do you create horror that is accessible to the sensitive soul? Like, do you add certain elements to it, or do you just kind of, like, how do you what do you do to gear it toward the audience that you want? Like the elements that you add.
I think it has a lot to do with irony or dramatic irony. It's really almost the same thing as comedy. The audience expects one thing and is given the other. And the example that Alfred Hitchcock gave is dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that the characters don't know. So you put a time bomb beneath a table, and a little girl is sitting at the table coloring a picture. That creates suspense and horror. And so it's usually just a matter of that. You give the audience information about something bad going to happen, or a premonition or a clue maybe they don't know. And that can make it even more scary when you only have a clue that something bad is going to happen. Because, again, like comedy, there's setups and payoffs. You set up this information to know that when you hear the sound of thudding, or you see the water droplet in the cup, you know that a Tyrannosaurus Rex is going to come and eat you. And so it's little devices like that, I think, is what makes horror work. And it doesn't, again, have to be gratuitous. It's mostly in the mind. And again, by delaying the payoff or the monster attack, the suspense increases and the effect is greater.
Miranda, did you have something to add? Oh, I saw your thing flicker, so I got excited.
I don't set out to write horror. It just happens to be the thing that I write. And I never knew until I went to a bookstore and I saw they had shelved my collection under horror. And I was like, oh, is that what I am? But when I do write, and I get to moments of violence or moments of, any kind of darker extremity, I'm always interrogating how much do you actually need on the page to get it across. And I think, it's very rare that I will actually have certain things on the page. If I can fade to black or just cut and show you the aftermath, I will do that. I'm much more interested in aftermaths anyway, about surviving the trauma, about conquering the monster. One of the things I really hated writing, but I could not see any. I did write in one novelette a scene of animal violence, and I could not get around it because it was the point of view character, and it's what she was seeing, and it is the thing that kind of jars her into rethinking her whole situation. But it killed me to write that scene. But so I'm always really interrogating motive for why that's there, and I kind of wish some other writers would do that too. I think it's a good thing to always be questioning is, how much do you need to show to get your point across?
Have you ever freaked yourselves out?
Yes.
No? From my mind. Oh, well. Okay, so we've talked a lot about as if they do it with purpose, and I definitely agree. Like one of my favorite horror books is not for a sensitive soul. It drops the F-bomb 20 times on one page, but yeah, I would too. But it does it for a purpose in the idea of on that same page, it talks about the poetry of the F-bomb. And then it turns it into an SOS code of bleep, 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 bleep this, bleep them, bleep that, bleep, bleep, bleep. And it's so, I just thought it was brilliant. I'm talking about House of Leaves, by the way, not for the sensitive soul. But it is one of my favorite horror books because everything it does has a purpose. So what books and reasons or what specific stories would you suggest to a person to expand their moral bubble? Not to jar them, but say, this is worth it. It's like, those people who never watch PG-13 movies, even if it's Disney. It's like, you're missing out on so much. Are there any things where you would suggest specifically to people, this is great, you should look this up, even though it's not your normal?
I think it's relative to somebody's tolerance level because, again, yeah, like you said, there's all sorts of things my wife won't watch that I will. And I used to be the same way. And I don't feel like it's that I've been desensitized over time. I feel it's kind of the opposite. Like I've been I guess I want to say the word encouraged, but that doesn't seem like the right word, empowered. I've gained courage and empathy and kind of a broader understanding over time. And so I guess to some degree that comes with desensitization. I'm a little more open to seeing gladiators be slain in an arena and gruesome things like that, because to me, it's history and it's empathy and it's the human condition. And I want to comprehend that. The one movie, again, that came to mind I want to recommend is Martin Scorsese's Silence. I think that's a great one for anybody wanting to explore more of a psychological horror. There is some violence in it, but it's not very gratuitous and it's quick and it doesn't dwell on it, but it's a good psychological horror film.
I would recommend, for people kind of coming in sideways, one novel I would recommend is The Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn, I might mispronounce, but Kiste, Kiste, which was a little tiny bit of body horror in it, but it was also just a really intense look at a Midwestern town in decline and how family structure crumbling under this economic pressure and how that plays out, especially among a generation of girls growing up in that town. And I think, things like that, where it's kind of almost on the border of literary and horror, are often a good way for people to kind of step into. And again, they can flip past, the page or two of like discussion of how her body is changing and just get back into sort of the family drama and the generational drama that's happening.
And mind you, I like spoilers, so keep that in mind. I actually would suggest maybe there's a podcast I listen to that's called Too Scary Didn't Watch, and they tell you the whole story from beginning to end, and that may be a good way to judge whether or not a particular movie is a good fit for you or not.
And I'm totally noting that down. Thank you.
You guys, some of like the classics, like Dracula by Bram Stoker, just because there really isn't a lot of violence. There's some blood. Obviously, it's Dracula, but it's also just the theme, the epistolary story. You get a lot of great, great exploration of the classics, and same thing with Frankenstein. Just to be able to explore that one really is a lot about the human, like just human nature and what it means to create something. And let's see. If there have been questions, might be open from the audience.
I have not. I need to.
I did write it down. So, with Stephen's suggestion, I wrote it down to look it up. A few of these I've written down. Is there another question?
I think the obvious answer is you got to test it in a writer's group, through a significant other, close friend, or better yet, some distant person that doesn't like you very much. See how they respond.
Yeah, I mean, you can test it, you can give it to friends, you can find people to beta read it, but also remember, that there's an audience for everything. And so what one person finds too much, another person will be like, this is the best thing and it's speaking to me. And there may be somebody out there who has really similar fears and will really appreciate your story the way it is. So I wouldn't think immediately of having to tone it down or having to change it, kind of trust your vision of the story and what you're trying to say first and foremost.
Another question is, what is your genre? If you know that, it might follow that it could be too scary or it couldn't possibly be too scary if you're going for the horror genre, hardcore horror or something of that nature, as opposed to maybe a young adult adventure with elements of horror in it.
Yeah, really key in who is your audience, and tell people that when you're sharing it with them, like, is this too dark for maybe a teenager, or is this too dark for middle schooler? Let them know when somebody is reading that, or even give it to a teenager. Maybe give it to someone who's older than the audience if you're scared of, or if you're worried about scaring them. Give it to someone older who might not be as scared, and then give it to, if they say it's safe, then test it out with the audience you're going for.
And just to add quick, if you're thinking about a longer career and writing for different levels, this is also where pen names or slight variations in your name can really come into play. And you can kind of separate out your older work from YA, middle grade, what have you, and kind of make sure that you're pitching different brands, in a way, to use a yucky word, but different brands to the right audience.
Is there another question?
All right, so next here, actually from me. The classic monsters who were absolute horrors at their inception have kind of gone in and out of fashion over time and are seen kind of as safe monsters now. What would you suggest for making those monsters come alive again, now that we have them kind of as safe monsters and considered kind of safe for sensitive people?
Well, I've studied this subject a little bit in film panels, the phenomenon of the 1950s monster films, and what was that all about? And the best answer I've found is that the monster films and these characters of classic literature, but specifically in the 50s, that's when it kind of hit hard. It became popular because it was the public psychology's way of responding to the horrors of World War II. You know, in Europe, you had these monsters. It was very offensive to the American sensibility that anyone would just kill innocent people for no reason. And so that manifested itself in the form of monsters. And so if we were to take these old classic monsters and make them work in a modern setting, that would be difficult because we've had the benefit of decades of cliche and tropes that have built up upon them that make them no longer scary. And there's also this lack of kind of public consciousness of this being a fear that needs to be manifested and explored through film, because it feels like that's already been done. So I would say I don't know a direct answer, but the process of finding the answer would be exploring the fears of the modern 21st century psyche and seeing how that could manifest itself in character form.
All right, so next, again from Sarah Shulsky.
Could I say something about that?
Oh, yep.
Oh, I just wanted to add that I write vampires. I love vampires, and I think the way I found to get back into vampires was to find the thing that I found frightening or disturbing about them, and just really, really lean into that. That maybe, bringing your individual fear to the table might be the thing that kind of gives it its new, or at least new take on an old trope. So.
Vampires, these monsters have been done so many times, but like just taking a normal human being, that's not scary, but you make it a madman, and suddenly, and he does certain things. It's what they do, or what their specific strengths are that makes them scary. Like, what is it? Oh, I really liked it. What is that movie? I'm blanking. Oh, The Quiet Place. Aliens have been done hundreds of times, but Quiet Place takes these aliens that will kill you if you make any noise. And that in and of itself is scary. Like, it didn't have to be aliens. It could have been anything, really. But, just it's how they, or what their strengths and what they come after you for, that will make them scary and unique.
All right, so next from Sarah Shulsky again. Do you think that there are certain genres that are better for sensitive types than others, or does it depend more on the writer or the reader than the genre? Also, if you would be willing, they would love to see some of your recommendations put in the chat after this, because they've missed some of the titles.
Miranda, you want to start? You look like you're itching.
I was moving a cat, but sure. I personally don't. I'm a big fan of reading a little bit of everything. There's something for everybody and everything. So I don't think you need to stick to one area.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Other than something that obviously has hardcore content in it, I think horror as a device exists across all genres, and I wouldn't say that any one genre should be excluded because it's ubiquitous. Horror's in everything.
Like, even if you go to paranormal romance, or it's like, sure, a lot of the paranormal is an element of horror, but a lot of them can be just erotica and gross. Genre is really an umbrella that covers a lot of things. So I would go more towards specific authors, just because specific authors will have their specific morals or their specific standards that they go for. And that way you can kind of gauge, like, oh, this author is in line with some of my standards, or they don't like to do sexual content, and so I would prefer their writing generally.
Yeah, I was thinking paranormal romance, but like one of my personal triggers is like sexual assault on the page, and so there's a lot of PNR that I tap out on right away. Sometimes ghost stories, especially kind of classic ghost stories, might be a way to ease into it. 19th century ghost stories tend to be kind of toned down on all levels. And I mean, there was a really intense thing in the late 19th century about spiritualism and trying to contact spirits that I think now feels a little antiquated, but it might be a good way to ease into some of the tropes of, sort of classic horror.
If anything, just stay in the middle grade section, maybe?
All right, so we only have the 4 minutes left before we are done for the afternoon and we are ready for our keynote. So go ahead and give us your pitches for your books, things that you're doing, what you've got coming up.
Miranda, you want to start?
So I only have the one book out. It is called Wonderland. It's a retelling of Alice in Wonderland, where Wonderland is actually the virus that messes with your emotions. If you want to find me, the best place to go is actually my website, which is mirandarenae.com. It'll have all the links to my socials.
Guess we're going backwards through. So, Stephen?
Yeah, as far as like horror, we do a Halloween show every October. So maybe I'll recommend you to my theater company. It's called greathalltheatrical.com. greathalltheatrical.com. And we're putting on a play in March called Bums the Musical. It's about singing, dancing bums in the 1920s, around the time of just before the Great Depression. And it's kind of a farce about finding joy in life in spite of one's crazy circumstances. But again, if you stick around till October, we have some bone-chilling, fun, family-ish, friendly horror as well. So it'd be fun to have you be a part of that. And our company is based in Spanish Fork at the Angelus Theaters, where we put on our shows usually.
So as I said at the start, I have a quartet of queer Gothic novellas. The first one was Harkworth Hall. It's 18th century ladies meeting cute and fighting an occult family and the sea monster they're trying to control. And then I also have two collections. The more recent one was Rare Birds, and that was on the preliminary ballot for the Stokers last year. And that's a little darker. I think the novellas were a little bit lighter and a little more emphasis on the romance, and the stories are dark.
Where can people find you?
Oh, my website is traversingz.com. I'll put it in the chat, but I'm also in Amazon and major bookstores, online bookstores. So
Awesome. I am Rae D'Arc. My book, Don't Date the Haunted, is available on Amazon. It is actually on sale just this weekend for LTUE because I love you guys. And you can, the sequel will be coming out. It is technically a standalone, but there will be a sequel coming out in April. And then my website is craydark.wordpress.com. And you can find my book reviews and behind the scenes for my book.